Since we're starting to get into some depth about how USD works, let's now look at what happens when you compose primitives on top of each other. Okay, so I'm in the example file and I'm looking at this section here called Examples of Composition, and we have a few assets that we've loaded into this, this network box here. And they're mostly just all asset references, and they're built with the component builder so that we brought them in using the asset reference node. And if we look at them here, there's just some simple hierarchy set under here. There's a proxy and a render geometry and a materials section as well. And just as a reminder, if we come up here, we can change it to the final render look or the preview look, the proxy look. So that's just something just to keep in mind here, that we have different geometries that we can kind of see in different render modes. And so let's just see what happens when we start to overlay something like our reference, our asset demo that we made earlier on top of this. So I'm just going to kind of reset this a little here. I'm going to clear out these variants. And so this has variants on it, which again, we'll get into a little bit later on how to set those up. But this is something that could be very commonly brought in USD. So as we talked about before, the asset reference, we can look at a very specific geometry. So let's just bring up maybe the squab here, and we'll add in a variant set for material, and we'll say the bricks. That's kind of an interesting looking one, right? So we've got our reference demo asset. So if we wire this in here, those are just going to be kind of both on our stage, both merged together basically in here. We have the two different assets, and that's all working the way we would want them to. I'm actually just going to rename this so that it's not pig asset one, but just like that. Great. So here we have these two assets, right? And what I want to do is, instead of having this come in separately, I want to have this come in over top of the pig asset. So what I can do here is change this destination primitive. We've changed it maybe to rename it, but we haven't really ever changed it to see what happens when we actually overwrite it. And so here we're changing it to the exact same name as is in our hierarchy. We could also control click up here to bring up our picker and choose that one as well. There's a few different ways you could do it. Obviously, we've talked about that previously. But what you can see now is that this has overwritten the geometry in here. Both our preview state and our render state are both now the squab with the bricks. Now the material that was in the pig asset is still here. If you look, we have a gold material. And that is still in this here, so that's retained because we don't overwrite the gold, but we do overwrite these, so those have been overwritten. So that's kind of what happens when you, by default, overwrite the entirety of something like that. It's going to just take the entirety of that asset and just kind of overlay it. If there's anything inside of there that's different, it'll keep that, but anything that's the same, it's going to overwrite with this new object that you're basically layering in or referencing in on top of it. So that is one way of looking at this. But let's just say we wanted to use something like this. I'm just going to make a different branch here. So let's just say we wanted to bring this torus in that I have. And so this extruded torus is kind of an interesting shape, but let's just say instead of this pig for our proxy geometry, we actually wanted this torus instead. Or maybe it's the render geometry, one or the other, it doesn't really matter. But let's take a look at this and actually have it load onto the proxy geometry of the pig asset. So what I can do here is I can actually click and drag this up here and drop it in here. So this is actually going to render it over top of this. And actually I went one too far with this, because actually what I wanted to do is overlay on the proxy. So I'm just going to remove this part here, and that's going to do that. So it doesn't seem like anything has really been done here, but since we're in the final render view, if we change to the preview, now this proxy geometry is in here. Now, granted, this is very complicated for the proxy, but in this case, we have our torus now in here. And what you might notice is that the gold material has been retained. So we have overwritten the geometry, but not that material reference that was to that primitive in here. So this is still keeping the same primitive here. And what you can see here that's a little bit kind of incorrect is that this is writing this as a component now, which we really don't want it to do. So what we can use here is actually this primitive definition. We can set our other primitives to just be overlay, right? So instead of trying to say, oh, this scope proxy primitive should change to a component because that's what we've told it from the SOP create. No, let's just have it bring the shape in, leave everything else as it is, and it's just basically overlaying it, maybe overlaying, transforms or just some simple things to it. But you can actually specify just overlaying the transforms or overlaying everything else without kind of redefining what that primitive is. So that is one way that you can do this here. So what we could do here as well is we could add a material library, drop this down, and here inside of it, I'm just going to add a new principled shader. And with this, I'm just going to add in this blue cloth so it's pretty obvious. And what we're going to do here is we can just add this on top of, we can assign this to geometry, and we could assign this to the render, like so. So now what we can see is that if we go to the final render, we're going to have this blue material on it. But if we're looking at the preview render, it's gold. So in this case, we can overlay something on top of just one portion of our primitives in our scene graph tree and be able to kind of control different things like that. Maybe it's a lower quality shader for your proxy. There's a ton of different options there. Obviously, it's very flexible, but that's just something to keep in mind that you can do there. And then finally here, we can take this toy asset, we can wire this in, and instead of having our pig asset be kept for the shape for the final render, we can actually have this toy asset come in as the render version here. So now what we can do, well, the problem here, actually, now that I'm realizing this, is that this is actually going to bring in that entire asset at that path, and we don't really want to do that. So what we actually need to do is change the reference that we're bringing in here, because this is an asset reference, it's a reference node, and we can select from a specific part of it. So if we control click here, this is going to open up the hierarchy inside of the rubber toy asset. We can go in here, we can find the render and the shape, and we can hit apply and OK. And so now, instead of doing it just to the render, we can add this to the shape. This is going to bring in that primitive there. Looks like I was just having a little viewport bug there. What I needed to do was just refresh this node, and it brought in the actual geometry there. So in this case, I'm taking the shape primitive here inside of the file reference and the destination primitive to the pig asset. And so now we have our pig asset here. We have the exact same hierarchy set here, but in this case we have different geometry in each of our two render settings here that we can do. So in our final render, we now have this blue toy, and in the preview we have a gold torus. So this is the way that you can kind of take primitives and overlay them on top of each other and create differences between versions of what you have on disk, like files that you have on disk, and be able to just non-destructively add things on top of this. We haven't changed anything to the pig asset, but obviously we're making these additions down the line, and that allows you to have extreme flexibility when working in USD. And in the next chapter, we're going to kind of break down why this is happening the way it is.